Last time we spoke about the Japanese advance to Liaoyang. After the loss at Telesu, the Russians began to scramble to defend multiple locations in Manchuria. With multiple Japanese armies advancing simultaneously, Kuropatkin could not be sure where they would hit next, and he found himself making matters worse when he ordered troops to hold too many places. The Russian losses at Tashichao, the passes at Feishuiling and Motian, Chaotou, Hushmircheng, Dawan, and Yangzuling were taking a toll upon the Russian forces. The Russians were in disarray, trying to delay so more troops could gather at Liaoyang and Mukden, but their efforts were being trampled upon. Even out at sea, Admiral Weitgift made an attempt to break out and join up with the Vladivostok squadron, but was likewise forced to pull back. Now multiple Japanese armies would converge to smash Liaoyang. Manchuria was slowly being conquered city by city. This episode is the Russo-Japanese War Part 6, the Battle of Liaoyang. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I have just released what was an exclusive Patreon podcast, episode 1 on my series about Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author of the Final War Theory. If you want to check out more exclusive podcasts over on my Patreon, by the way, you can find it at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is on Yang Qiangjong, the supposed Korean man who fought for the Japanese Empire, the USSR, and Nazi Germany during World War II. But is the story true? Come find out. The Russians had just been served multiple defeats. Not a single one of Kuropatkin's formations had been spared the humiliation. A Times correspondent had this to say: "There is such a thing as the tradition of defeat, and unenviable is the army that creates it." The commander of the European 17th Corps, General Baron Bildering, was appointed commander of the Eastern Front. In addition to his 17th Corps, he received the 3rd Siberian Army Corps and the 10th Corps. The two opposing armies spent 3 weeks skirmishing with another over the course of 6 mountainous miles. On the 3rd of August, Haicheng, that had seen so much attention and effort dedicated to it, was entered with little opposition. The Russians had spent so much time at Haicheng building up its fortifications and expecting a very real battle that never took place. To make matters worse, so much supplies had been brought over to Haicheng. The Russians did not have enough time to destroy or move all of it, so the Japanese took it for a price. The 1st, 2nd, and 4th IGA now met at Haicheng as Kuropatkin's front was reduced from 140 to 45 miles. The Russian main body was now deployed along the railway at Anshanchan, 22 miles northeast of Haicheng, and around 20 miles west of Liaoyang. The war took its toll on Kuropatkin by this point. If you've ever heard the memes about the US president's look before and after presidency, you know, like that famous picture of Obama with gray hair, it's kind of like that as a situation. Kuropatkin was said to be unrecognizable by August of 1904. He had that 1,000-mile stare. Or as Stavros would say, that 1,000-island stare. If you know that meme, then good on you. Kuropatkin sat huddled in a carriage riding through Liaoyang, not even acknowledging or looking at men who saluted him. Kuropatkin was an experienced military man. He had worked in numerous political positions. He was a very distinguished figure, but at this point he was broken. The Japanese were consolidating and advancing upon Liaoyang now. His overcaution, lack of determination, and a gradual erosion of his confidence in the face of a growing admiration for the enemy was losing him the war. Kuropatkin cabled the Tsar that he had withdrawn from Haicheng to Liaoyang because, quote, "The Japanese superiority in numbers. They were accustomed to hills and hot weather. They were younger, carried lighter loads, and had numerous mountain artillery and pack transport. Their energetic and intelligent leadership, the extraordinary patriotism and military spirit of their troops, and a lack of such a spirit on our side, caused by a general ignorance of what we were even fighting for." To me personally, this telegram sounds a lot like someone simply stating, "They are better than us, sir." It is pure defeatism, a completely unwarranted one, mind you. The war was not lost by any margin. Liaoyang was a city holding a population of roughly 60,000. The railway had a north-southwest-east junction at Liaoyang, and the Taitsu River ran north of the city. It was a walled city, by this point held around 3 lines of defense running some 40 miles long, something Kuropatkin called his zone of maneuver. The railway line running south from Harbin remained the Russians' only line of communication, while the Japanese had the benefit of 2 lines. Liaoyang was a vital junction not just for the rail, but also for roads. The old Mandarin Road ran up the west coast of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, both passing through places like Liaoyang before going to Korea. The Taitsu River was a tributary of the Liao River, flowing east and west into the sea. There are 3 important tributaries: the Lan and Tang rivers east of Liaoyang, and the Sha River in her south. The battlefield of Liaoyang would have the Mandarin roads on the flat open plains of the Liao Valley to the west. Here there was an abundant amount of kuliang, over 9 feet tall, offering a lot of coverage. To the east of the Mandarin roads, spurs rose up taller than mountains. Within the city, the railway station was sitting near the northwest wall. The station was constantly receiving materials of war and troops. Nearby to the railway station was the Russian headquarters. Despite the incoming battle, the Russians allowed normal civilian life to go by, yet again allowing the numerous Japanese spies to do their work. Kuropatkin's troops busied themselves with vodka and women. Even Kuropatkin's chief of staff was allowed some time off to go see his girlfriend, as Kuropatkin shouldered the additional work. The Battle of Liaoyang was to be a decisive battle, something Kuropatkin wrote himself in his memoirs. If the Russians lost at Liaoyang, their communication lines in China would be cut. The resources of the Liao Plain would be lost, something their interior economy depended upon. And of course, Port Arthur would be in even more trouble. Kuropatkin did all he could to delay the enemy so he could build up his forces at Liaoyang. If it fell, all that was left was Mukden. On August the 3rd, Kuropatkin and Alexiev met at Liaoyang. Both men understood the threat the Japanese advance meant. Alexiev wanted an offensive to be made against the 1st IGA, whereupon Kuropatkin was forced to speak to him like a toddler about the reality of the situation. The string of defeats had destroyed the Russian morale. They lacked sufficient officers. Their strength was both qualitatively and quantitatively less than that of the enemy. Alexiev would depart believing he had achieved some sort of compromise with Kuropatkin to get him to agree to fight at Liaoyang. But of course, this was what Kuropatkin sought regardless. Liaoyang was defended by 3 lines of defense. The innermost line ran close to the city, anchored across the river on the northern bank. The line held 8 forts with 130 old pattern guns, all dug in. Flank protection, obstacles, ditches, and a ton of cover provided an impressive line of defense. This defensive line was watched and mapped out by the Chinese spies working for Lieutenant Colonel Izama. Its number 1 weakness was some high ground 6 miles southeast of it. If that high ground was seized, artillery could be placed upon it and rain down fire into the city and the railway station. The next line of defense ran a radius of 7 miles from the city. The line went from Manchuria in the northeast to a feature 693 feet high overlooking the railway. The outermost line was about 15 miles out, going from Anshanshan to Anping. The line was not as strong as the inner line, but offered substantial obstacles against an enemy. The Russians believed the Japanese would perform two basic courses of action. The first would be to turn a flank. The second would be to throw a frontal attack against the successive lines of defense. To turn a flank, the Japanese would need to cross a river, leaving them very vulnerable to Russian counterattacks, provided by their reserves. The Japanese frontal attack would progressively exhaust itself, setting up counterstrokes. The battle would be the first time the leaders of each side would be directly commanding. The Japanese troops were confident, well-practiced, and yet to be served a real defeat. Despite all of the losses, Kuropatkin's withdrawals were performed perfectly. He still retained superior numbers, and this battle was quite open to either side winning. The Russians divided themselves into three groups: the Southern Group, Eastern Group, and reserves. General Zarubayev led the Southern Group, consisting of the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Siberian Corps, entrenched at Anshanshan. 10 miles south of his position were the advance guards with the Army Reserve taken from all three corps. Amongst them were 11 cavalry squadrons and 6 guns under General Mishinka. Baron Bildering led the Eastern Group, consisting of the 3rd Siberian and 10th European Corps. They were deployed in a semicircle between the Tang and Tansu rivers. To the left of the Tansu was the brigade of the 17th Corps. A bridge connected this detachment to the main body. The reserves were all at Liaoyang, under Kuropatkin's direct command. They consisted of 30 battalions taken from the 2nd Siberians and 17th Corps. All the way over at Mukden were the recently arrived 5th Siberian Corps, of which 8 battalions were ordered to advance to the Taitsu River to guard the left flank. Also at Mukden were elements of the 1st European Corps. The Russians took specific care to guard their flanks and railway, but most of the detachments were in the east, while approaches from the west were somewhat neglected. At this point in the war, there was a large possibility China might actually enter the war on Japan's side. This indeed was something Kuropatkin would worry about often. It had major consequences, of course. If China entered the war, it most likely would draw in France, but that would also draw in Britain, both of whom would seek to end the hostilities. Such a situation would be against Japan's interests. Japan was actively doing everything she could to stop the Chinese from such actions. But publicly, Japan was also fanning rumors of such things occurring using her spy network. Such rumors spoke of how General Ma had gathered a 3,000-strong force along the western borders of Manchuria. Other rumors spoke of how a Japanese army was about to land at Yingkou to join forces with a large Honghu force. All of these rumors fed a sort of paranoia to Kuropatkin, and Kuropatkin also was suffering from some rather bad intelligence. He believed the Japanese outnumbered him heavily, but in reality, he had some 158,000 men, and the commander-in-chief of the IGA, General Oyama, held only 125,000. Thus, the Russians had the numbers. Oyama enjoyed perfect intelligence on this, and he knew every day that the Russian numbers were growing. Thus, Oyama ordered his commanders to keep grabbing the initiative, because if they did not, the Russians would soon overwhelm them. Meanwhile, something else was deeply concerning Oyama. Nogi was besieging Port Arthur, and things were going terribly. Oyama had hoped Port Arthur would fall before he tossed the kitchen sink at Liaoyang, but he could wait no longer. Kuropatkin's cavalry, which he referred to as, quote, "old men on little horses," were not exactly living up to what he thought they should be. He relied on his cavalry for intelligence, and they would often over-exaggerate just about anything they saw. His cavalry were 3 times larger than that of the Japanese. They should have been crushing them in every single battle. Now, every day that passed by was a victory for the Russians. Already, the 5th Siberians at Vladivostok were being diverted over to Liaoyang. Time was everything. Kuropatkin planned to hold the line between Anshanshan and Anping with a strong covering force, 3 corps strong, that is. He planned to hold back some reserves to hit the Japanese when they began a frontal attack, and this strategy did not sit well with generals like Bildering or Sluchevsky. Both generals did not like the idea of fighting in front of an unfordable river and advised pulling the entire force back to the Liaoyang's inner defense. Sluchevsky took this a step further, recommending they take up a new defensive position between Mukden and Liaoyang. Kuropatkin would write this in his memoirs. These officers reiterated the same opinions still more forcibly early in August, when the difficulty of moving their troops towards Liaoyang became greatly increased by the heavy rains. The viceroy, who was much perturbed about the fate of Port Arthur by the news of the unfortunate result of the naval operations on August the 10th, and whose fears were increased by Stoessel's highly alarmist reports, was at the same time urging me, on August the 15th, to assist the fortress and make an advance of some sort, though it were only a demonstration towards Haicheng. Kuropatkin messaged the Tsar about the conflicting ideas, and the Tsar replied that he was the acting commander, so he knew best, and would decide what was to be done, not his subordinates. On the 7th of August, Kuropatkin told Bildering that they would fight a decisive battle, and it would be along the Anshan-Anping line. However, 2 days later, Kuropatkin instructed the commander of the 3rd Siberians, General Ivanov, that his job was only to act as a rearguard, and not to enter into the foray of battle. Ivanov was a bit bewildered by this, and he sought further clarification, to which Kuropatkin said, "They were to avoid a desperate struggle, and simultaneously to hold their positions and gain time, but to retreat to the main defenses at Liaoyang if seriously attacked, without permitting themselves to be demoralized or disorganized." And thus, Ivanov basically planned for a retreat from the line before any fighting was to be had. Then on August the 23rd, Kuropatkin changed his mind completely and reaffirmed the decisive battle would be fought on the Anshan-Anping line. He wrote this to Struchevsky, who was commanding the 10th Corps. "Under these circumstances, I do not think we need to confine ourselves to fighting rearguard actions in the positions occupied by the 10th and 3rd Siberian Army Corps, and by the troops on the southern front. I am resolved to fight in those positions with all the forces apportioned to their defense, to beat the enemy back, and to assume the offensive should be a favorable opportunity present itself." It seems the Russian intelligence throughout August bolstered Kuropatkin. There were reports the 2nd IGA relinquished 3 to 4 divisions to help at Port Arthur. This, of course, was not true, and most likely fed to the Russians by Japanese spies. There was another report 30 to 40,000 Japanese in Oku's army were facing a cholera outbreak. Again, this was not true. It seemed to the Russians the Japanese were at any moment at least performing defenses in front of Liaoyang. Kuropatkin instructed Struchevsky to prepare a possible offensive should an opportunity present itself, but reaffirmed Bildering and Zarubayev would maintain their positions. Thus the outer defensive line changed a bit, something that would aid Oyama. Back over on the Japanese side, they were wargaming a few options before them. Everything did not look good on the board, and ultimately they decided to pursue a simple course of action. They would exert pressure across the whole Russian line until the combined force could initiate a converging attack. At this point, Oyama would decide whether they hit the left, center, or right. From his HQ at Haicheng, Oyama ordered his forces to drive the Russians from their forward position to their main position, hopefully by August the 28th. The 1st IGA was to advance west of the Tang River. The 4th IGA would advance against the main Russian line by the 29th, and the 2nd IGA would advance along the Sha River to coordinate with the 4th IGA. The 1st IGA began their advance on the 26th, followed by the Guards Division 3 days prior. The major attack would be performed by the 2nd and half of the 12th Division against the 10th Corps at Anping. The other half of the 12th, with a Kobe Brigade, would hit the Russian left. Their assault was scheduled for the night of the 25th. The advance of the Japanese force was terrible. It was a muddy nightmare, making the movement of their heavy artillery pieces quite difficult. General Nishinka's cavalry were patrolling in a gap between the 2 Russian groups, but they had pulled back into the reserve. Kuropatkin planned to use them as a hammer later on. The gap was thus filled in by weaker detachments. The Japanese Guards Division were advancing upon the 3rd Siberians, while the 10th Division of the 4th IGA were hitting the gap. Kuropatkin watched this with despair, believing the Guards Division were actually 3 divisions strong. The Russians went into a state of frantic reinforcement. Kuropatkin ordered the 17th Corps to maintain their position, while detaching the 35th Division from them to give to Ivanov's 3rd Siberians without telling Bildering. To further assist the 3rd Siberians, the 10th Corps were ordered to attack eastward on the 26th, thus protecting the 3rd right flank. Reserves were tossed southwards just before the Russians were attacked. General Lubovin on the 25th reported he believed the Japanese would cross the Taitsu River, and this caught the attention of both Kuropatkin and Bildering, to make sure that such gaps were filled up. Thus, the 10th Corps were now exposed to the combined attacks of the 2nd and 12th IJ divisions. On the 25th, the Guards Division surged into the 3rd Siberians' outposts. During the night, it seemed inevitable the Japanese were going to be exerting a lot of pressure on the 10th Corps, so offensive actions were officially cancelled. At 6:10 a.m., Japanese artillery was beginning to support the Guards Division, hitting the 3rd Siberians' position, which sat on a ridge rising some 1,000 feet above the river valley. The Russian artillery dueled from better firing positions until 4 p.m., removing the Japanese artillery threat from the sector. Until 8 p.m., the Russian artillery battered the Japanese unchallenged. The Guards Division were thus severely hamstrung by the Russian artillery, but they continued without artillery support and threatened to break through into a gap between the two army groups. Meanwhile, Colonel Martinov of the Zaresk Regiment, 35th Division, alongside a cavalry squadron and battery, began to hear gunfire 5 miles in front of their position. Martinov was ordered forward, and he ran into the Russian line held by General Grekov, along with multiple cavalry squadrons. Grekov reported the situation to Martinov, and they planned to toss a counterattack. The cavalry squadrons were not forthcoming for such an action, however. Thus, Martinov aided him by moving unseen up a valley to hit the left flank of the advancing Japanese line. 3 batteries began firing into the Japanese flank with such a devastating effect, General Asada had to order his brigade to withdraw. The attacker had become the attacked. The commander of the Guards Division, upon seeing the 3rd Siberian Corps' entrenchments, requested reserves be brought up. By 8 a.m., word was sent to Kuroki, who promised him the entire army reserve. Unfortunately, said reserves were marching from Fangguancheng and were exhausted by the time they reached the Guards at 6 p.m. In order to save Asada's brigade, his divisional commander ordered a 3-battalion-strong attack against the center of the 3rd Siberian Corps. The attack was intended to be a diversion, nothing too serious. By 4 p.m., the Japanese artillery were snuffed out. Their infantry failed to make any progress, and thus they pulled back conveniently under the cover of a storm. Now 4 miles northeast of Anping is a saddle known as Hong Shaing. It elevates around 1,900 feet and dominates the Tang Valley. The Tambov Regiment of the 9th Division were atop it. Their divisional commander placed 9 battalions along the front line, each one responsible for about a mile of the line. Within his reserve were another 7 battalions. They had 2 field batteries and 4 mountain guns in the position. The 9th Division were about to be hit by Kuroki's 2nd IGA's main central thrust, supported by the 12th Division's 12th Brigade. The 23rd Brigade of General Kigoshi were given the task of seizing Hong Shaing. Now, Hong Shaing is a formidable steep and rocky ridge. Its northern edge covers the Taitsu River, while its southern overlooks the Tang River, flowing through the Hongsha Pass. The lower slopes are covered in trees, but then it becomes 40 yards of open steep ground. The Tambov Regiment positioned their 6 field guns on a narrow 20-yard wide ridge for the best visibility possible, but this also made them quite vulnerable. Kuroki's men had little chance of taking such a position. Anyone who approached would be met with blankets of shrapnel and bullets. The ridge did have one weak spot, however. In front of it was a carpet of dead ground which could not be properly covered by the defenders. The attackers could use their artillery there to hit them. The 2nd and 12th IJ divisions attacked the 10th Corps' position on the night of the 25th. The 2nd Division advanced in 2 columns, attacking the right-hand side of the 10th Corps. By 8 a.m., the attack was petering out without any progress. The 12th Division advanced in 5 columns and managed to penetrate the Russian line, and this led the Russian units to pull back somewhat, exposing the left flank and Hong Shaing. At 8:30 p.m. on the 25th, the 23rd IJ Brigade began their approach upon Hong Shaing. Just after 1 a.m., 2 battalions joined up, taking a nearby spur called Surabachi Yama, while another regiment to their northwest position was moving 2 mountain guns on the North Papaling. The Japanese were quite exposed in the isolated pockets. They prodded around, but were repelled every time from the defenders upon their heights. At dawn, the fighting really began. The Japanese artillery, located at a place called One Tree Pass, moved forward under fire from the Tambov Regiment. The Tambov commander sent 3 companies to counterattack as the Japanese were motioning for a toehold upon the hill. For 2 hours, the battle raged back and forth. The Russians then received word the 9th Division on their right had withdrawn. At this point, their reserve was down to half, while the Japanese had depleted their own. The Russians began the age-old tactic of tossing boulders down the hill upon the advancing Japanese, to great effect. By midday, both sides were exhausted and bloody. General Sucheski of the 10th Corps watched Hong Shaing struggle nervously. He continuously requested reinforcements from Bildering, but Bildering believed he was overreacting, and he refused to release the 3rd Division. Bildering was withholding the 3rd Division because he sought to use them in an emergency if perhaps the Japanese managed to cross the Taitsu River. He was also being fed information from Ivanov that he was facing far more units than he actually was. At 3:30 p.m., the Japanese artillery began to fire again, fiercely targeting Hong Shaing. The Japanese attacked from the south, but to no avail. A concurrent attack from the north in regimental strength was more successful. The Japanese swept past some abandoned batteries, causing nearly 50% casualties upon their occupants, before they pulled out. The Tambov Regiment clung to the southern portion of the ridge, but their CO was wounded and 500 out of their 2,500 men were dead or too wounded to fight. By 6 p.m., the regiment was withdrawing through Peiko under the cover of a storm. It was a terrible loss, because the 3rd Siberians were crushing the 12th IJ Division, and the loss of Hong Shaing would completely negate this. While Tambov's regiment were pulling out, Sucheski sent the last regiment of his corps reserve to Peiko while pleading with Bildering for aid. At 8 p.m., Bildering agreed to send 2 regiments of the 10th Corps, but they were far too late. Kuropatkin received word of the fall of Peiko sector, and he ordered it recaptured immediately, for it threatened the entire outer defensive line. All the while, a storm raged, and with so much rain, reports came that the Tang River was rising and that her bridges might be lost at any moment, leaving the only viable crossing point for the 10th Corps at a bridge 3 miles north of Anping, which was now being dominated by the Japanese position at Peiko. The 10th Corps were withdrawing, and this in turn threatened the position of the 3rd Siberians. That night, Kuropatkin ordered the entire army to withdraw to the 2nd defensive line. The situation of the southern group was nowhere near as desperate as the eastern group. Sadobayev was ordered to resist, but he also had to withdraw once the enemy began its main attack. The 26th had been a rather quiet day. Then on the 27th at 6 a.m., the southern group began their withdrawal. The eastern group conducted a difficult and rather dangerous withdrawal through the rained-out roads, but made it to their advanced positions without conflict. The energy was sapped out of the men. General Stackelberg, commanding the 1st Siberians, asked Zadobayev if his troops could rest on the 28th, and Zadobayev agreed. For some strange reason, General Zazulich's 2nd Siberians did not comply like the rest, and they continued to retreat, and this move exposed the left flank of the stationary 4th Siberians holding a central position. The 4th Siberians could not retreat because the road heading north was blocked. The 3rd and 5th IJ divisions had advanced too quickly. Zadobayev ordered Zazulich to stop his withdrawal, but he did not comply. Zadobayev sent the order again, and yet Zazulich did not comply. Kuropatkin then ordered Zazulich to turn back and to help cover the withdrawal of the corps that he had effectively abandoned, stating, "If it were necessary to do so, to cover the retreat of those corps, to fight to the last man and perish." Gradually, the Russians got to their second lines of defense, but it was a terribly messy ordeal. Countless supplies were abandoned, an entire battery was left on a road. Teams of men trying to grab materials were being fired upon by Japanese who did not let up. And thus the first round of defenses were defeated. It was a confused mess. The 3rd Siberians and 10th Corps received a blow to their morale. With the contraction of forces to the secondary advance line, Kuropatkin now placed his 17th Corps on the north bank of the river. The second line of defenses were around 7 miles south of Liaoyang, and they included numerous hills that were heavily fortified. The contraction of the Russian line also afforded more defense, but this in turn allowed Oyama to encircle them easier. As darkness fell on August 29th, Oyama issued his orders to attack, and he took the 2nd IJ's 4th Division under his personal command. The 2nd IJ would advance upon the Shushanpu position to Huslintun, overlooking the Tasu Brook. To the right was the 4th IJ, who would attack the area from Huslintun to Caofantun. The Guards Division with other elements would attack the line of hills running northeast. The 12th Division with support from the 15th Brigade and the 2nd Division's artillery would cross the Taitsu River to try and turn the Russian left flank. Thus, 3 Japanese divisions would be attacking the 1st Siberian Corps west of the Tasau Brook. To the east of the Tasau Brook, the 10th Division, 10th Brigade, Guards Division, and 3rd Brigade would attack the 3rd Siberian Corps and 10th Corps. Assuming the units got over the Taitsu River, the 2nd and 12th Divisions would hit the 17th Corps. Kuropatkin outnumbered the Japanese significantly in the east, not so much in the west. Oyama kept his 4th Division in his own hands to meet any possible Russian countermoves. At dawn on the 30th, the attack began. There was little progress to be made as the Russian artillery battered the attackers back. The casualties were immense for some units. The 2nd Regiment only got within 1,000 yards of the Russian lines and suffered 71 deaths and 325 wounded for the day. The 2nd Guards Brigade, supported by a Kobe Battalion, attacked a 1,030-foot hill held by the 11th East Siberian Regiment and the 36th Regiment. The Japanese managed to seize forward trenches, but soon Russian batteries came in and dislodged them. At 5 a.m., the 10th IJ Division with 2 Kobe regiments attacked some heights south and west of Caofantun, held by the 3rd Corps. The fighting was vicious, and the Russians charged out of their trenches to meet the Japanese bayonet to bayonet. British Captain James Jardine, attached with the 2nd IJ, wrote this of the action. Whenever one side charged, the other side always charged to meet them. To a listener, the effect was extraordinary. A hot musketry fight might be in progress, when suddenly the Russians would sound the charge. Instantly, all firing would cease on either side, the Japanese cheering wildly in answer to the drums and bugles of the enemy. The Russians cheer, "Hurrah!" The Japanese on such desperate occasions would cheer, "Wa-ah-ah." The impression given by these cheers, mingled with the rattle of drums and the changlor of the bugles, was more melancholy than martial, sounding like a prolonged wail of grief ascending from the troubled earth into the dark heavens. The 3rd Battalion of the 23rd East Siberian Regiment bore the brunt of the attack, and within 20 minutes lost all of their officers and 304 of their 502 soldiers. A Russian battery rushed over at a range of 600 yards and battered the Japanese, tossing them back. Oyama's strategy at this point was to unhinge the Taso Brook position so the 4th IJ could turn the flank of the 1st and 3rd Corps. The Japanese were gradually pushing forward, getting their artillery in range to do more effective damage. Ultimately, the Japanese were halted, but Kuropatkin was nervous the Japanese would succeed in turning the flank. Kuropatkin began to shuffle some units around, and this allowed the Japanese to seize the village of Ulantai, and they began shelling Hill 693 and Mayutun. The 2nd IJ advanced along the railway, with the 5th Division and the 4th IJ supporting them to the right. Their combined force began forcing open a gap. Stackelberg began requesting reinforcements from Kuropatkin, but Kuropatkin rejected this, believing the Japanese could not be so strong everywhere along the line, and thus things must be already stabilizing. Stackelberg was instructed to assist the 3rd Corps, but if their position and his was untenable, they should withdraw to the inner defensive line. The attacks opening the gap to the Taso Brook were increasing in strength, prompting Stackelberg to plead again for reinforcements. Despite the pressure the Japanese were applying since 6 a.m., it was not until 11 a.m. when their line was complete and ready to really assault. At 12:45 p.m., Stackelberg yet again requested more reinforcements, and this time he was granted them. But unfortunately, they were coming over from the Hill 693 sector, and it was being heavily delayed. Stackelberg frantically plugged gaps in his line until 2 p.m. when finally some reinforcements arrived. Meanwhile, Mishinka grabbed a mixed force of 15 battalions drawn from numerous corps and charged into the Japanese north of Hill 693. The action was uncoordinated and basically saw the men just filling a defensive line instead of actually dislodging the Japanese attackers upon the hill. Stackable reported at 4:40 p.m. he had fully stabilized his lines. The Knights saw numerous attacks launched against Hill 693 at Maoyutun, but without success. To make a demonstration, the Japanese demoted 3 generals for their lack of success. One of those generals was the father of Hideki Tojo. One commander who had a chance of success was General Kuropatkin, however. Bold action was required, so Kuropatkin took action at 1 p.m. on his own initiative to order a crossing of the river stated for 11 p.m. that night. At midnight, his forces began to cross the Taitsu River, unopposed, going some 15 miles to the east of Liaoyang. The water was around 3 feet deep, where they crossed. Russian dragoons at the scene watched the Japanese cross the river and establish a bridgehead. They frantically sent word to Kuropatkin, which only reached him by 11 a.m. because their telephones were having issues. The Russians had lost the vital opportunity to smash the Japanese as they were crossing. Cavalry forces under Lubavin, who were supposed to be screening, were instead withdrawing, leaving the infantry. The morning of the 31st saw further Russian attacks upon all strategic features. Hisunitun was being enveloped slowly, Hill 693's 4 trenches were being overwhelmed and seized, though the Japanese artillery would tragically hit their own men in the process. The Russians and Japanese atop Hill 693 ended up fighting to the bitter end with bayonets. The 34th IJ Regiment suffered 487 deaths with 632 wounded. The 3rd East Siberian Regiment facing them took about 35% officer and 38% casualties upon their troops in the process. Shushan Hill was a similar clash, with a surprise attack being performed around the villages of Maoyutun and Kuchaotsu, but Russian machine guns managed to save them. Oyama still held back his 4th Division, wary of counterattacks. By nightfall, the Russian line not only held, it caused 3,000 casualties upon the Japanese. The saving grace was only to be Kuropatkin's river crossing, which gravely worried Kuropatkin, who issued orders to his corps commanders, titled Disposition No. 3. The plan was for a general retreat to the inner defensive line, while reserves would be launched to hit Kuropatkin's bridgehead. At that time, they were estimated to be about 70,000 men strong. At 7:30 p.m., the corps commanders initiated the command. Kuropatkin was still under the belief the enemy was much larger than they actually were. He had thus handed them a victory at the second line, and it was completely unwarranted. By 1 a.m., the Japanese were discovering the Russians were withdrawing, and by 3 a.m., the Japanese seized all the features that they had been bleeding for. With the first light of day, they can now see Liaoyang more clearly, as they brought their artillery closer and closer. At this point, Oyama believed he was dealing with a routed army. The 17th Siberian Army Corps were now divided. Over on the right, the 3rd Division was now holding Hill 1057. To the left was Lieutenant General Dobrzynsky's 35th Division, who were on Hill 920. The Corps Reserve was to the rear at the village of Shahaotsun, led by Major General Glasgow. Facing them was Kuropatkin. Kuropatkin observed the new Russian lines and saw a 75-foot knoll. It was the Russians' vital ground. Vital ground was a terrain that, if possessed by an enemy, it would seriously interfere with one's defense. Kuropatkin called the knoll Manchuria, meaning Rice Cake Hill. Major General Okasaki's 15th Brigade of the 2nd Division was given the mission of seizing Hill 920 and Manchuria, while the 12th Division would advance to cut off the railway. At 8:30 a.m., the artillery began to duel, and the Japanese took care to batter Manchuria. At 9:30 a.m., the 15th Brigade, with the 12th Division's artillery for support, began to attack Manchuria. They would be joined by the 23rd Brigade. As daylight was dimming, the firefight over Manchuria remained fierce. The knoll was heavily fortified. The Russians knew it was of the utmost importance to hold it. By 10:30 p.m., the Japanese managed to gain a toehold on the north side of the knoll. Meanwhile, the battle for Hill 920 resulted in the Russians gradually evacuating the position. Their evacuation led to further units of the 17th Corps pulling back, weakening the overall line. The Russians launched 2 counterattacks against Hill 920, but both failed, seeing them pull out of the area by 4 a.m. With the loss of Hill 920 also came the loss of Manchuria. Now, 3 Russian corps were severely restricted in their ability to maneuver. Within the Japanese hands, Manchuria provided the element of a shield to protect further river crossings. This was a literal catastrophe for the Russians' defense. Kuropatkin sought to advance the forces to sweep away Lubavin's cavalry, to approach the Yantai mines, and to seize the junction of the Yantai mines Mukden Railway. Meanwhile, Kuropatkin was not informed of the loss of Manchuria. Bildering only reported a hill to the northeast was captured, but that he would soon recapture the position when he reorganized his reserves. When the loss of Manchuria became known, the 1st Siberian Corps was ordered to come up alongside the 17th Corps and attack the Japanese right flank and the rear. General Orlov, commanding the 54th Division of the 5th Siberian Corps, was ordered to cooperate with the 17th Corps and recapture Manchuria. Orlov was to take orders from Bildering, and received orders at 7 p.m. on September the 1st to attack the Japanese position alongside the 17th Corps at dawn. However, 2 hours later, Orlov received other orders stating this: "Your principal task is to keep in touch with Bildering, and if he is not attacked, to act in a manner which has been indicated. If, however, he is attacked at Iskwantun, you will move to his support by the shortest route." Orlov was confused by this, and he sent word to Bildering asking for clarification, but his messenger got lost in the field of Kolyang. Rather than do nothing, Orlov took up a position south of the Yantai mines, with Samsonov waiting for orders to strike. From his new position, Orlov could see the fighting on Manchuria. It seemed the 17th Corps were in deep battle, so Orlov acted. He left Samsonov's cavalry with 2 battalions and 8 guns to defend the Yantai mines as he rushed forward. Orlov's force became disorganized in some Kolyang fields. His artillery was unable to keep up with him properly. Most of Orlov's men were reservists, and when they met the enemy, everything fell to absolute ruin. By 1 p.m. it was clear to Orlov that his force was in a hopeless position. His main body was losing a battle of attrition, and his left flank was about to be turned. Amidst the slaughter, a messenger showed up at 1:10 p.m., telling Orlov the 17th Corps were falling apart and to act with extreme caution. Orlov replied, "As I am unable to effect a junction with either the 1st Siberian or 17th Corps, I am falling back to Yantai Station." The Japanese chased their terrified fleeing opponents in a tremendous rout. Stackelberg's battered 1st Siberian Corps were advancing in 2 columns when they came across Orlov's rabble fleeing westwards. Stackelberg, in a very sick state, ordered Orlov to grab his 1 remaining battalion and to head right back into the Kolyang forest to hit the Japanese artillery. Orlov personally led the battalion into the fray of battle, and he was hit 5 times in the head and stomach. His battalion was completely destroyed. What would remain of them would limp back to the Yantai mines. The Japanese set up an artillery on the Shoshan Hill and began firing upon the western defenses of Liaoyang, and as told to us by a correspondent of the Times, "The civilized world has never seen anything to compare with the final preparations for the advance of the Japanese infantry. The massed and scattered batteries took the line of Russian resistance in sections. The 250 guns opened first on the Russian settlement. Great columns of dust and smoke rose up from amidst the gray stone buildings. Then suddenly out of the whirlwind of bursting shells shot up great tongues of lurid flame. The very rocks of Shushan quivered with the blasts of every recurrent discharge. The air shrieked with the rush of high-velocity projectiles. The railway station was evacuating the wounded and civilians, and it became the primary target for the Japanese artillery. Shells burst over the post office, the Red Cross tents, over a hospital, over numerous homes and businesses. It was pure chaos. Despite the breakthrough where Orlov was wounded, many Russian positions were still holding. Kuropatkin left Liaoyang at 6 a.m. for the eastern side of the battlefield. He received signals from multiple commanders that Manchuria was captured, but Bildering continued to send word back to him that he was about to regain the future. Kuropatkin ordered Zarubayev to perform an offensive to buy some time. The offensive would cost 1,200 Russian casualties. In the meantime, General Dobrodzinsky's 35th Division was ordered to recapture Manchuria. Dobrodzinsky's men advanced through the Kolyang forest, but Bildering continued to issue reports that he was, quote, just about to attack the future. prompting Kuropatkin to continuously postpone Dobrzyński's attack until it was nighttime. And when they did attack, they received no support and were defeated with heavy losses. On September the 2nd, during the afternoon, Kuropatkin received news of Orlov's defeat. The 12th IJ had lost 180 men. Orlov had lost 1,450. Absolutely crushing. Numerous Russian units converged against Manchuria. 7 battalions from the 1st European and 5th Siberian Corps attacked it from the right. General Vasiliev held 13 battalions of the 10th Corps in the center, and on the left were 6 battalions of the 17th Corps under Colonel Itsumin. Atop Manchuria was the 15th Brigade with one other regiment already battered. At 2:15 p.m., 152 guns began firing upon the feature until 7 p.m. The Russian infantry began to advance at 7 p.m. when darkness was falling. The Russians quickly became disoriented in the Liaoyang field. Friendly fire occurred almost everywhere. Many of the Russians would not even make it within 20 yards to hurl grenades at the Japanese trenches. By 8:30, the Russians had to pull back. Later that night, magnesium flares were launched and a fierce assault was made. By 9 p.m., the attack became chaotic. Too many troops of both armies were now intermingled. The Russian national anthem literally had to be played to get the troops back to their assembly positions. At 11 p.m., the Russians were being pushed away, while Bildering continued to report to Kuropatkin. "At any moment, the pivot will be back in our hands." In reality, the Russian attacks were definitely being beaten back. 3 Russian regimental commanders and 300 troops were dead. On September the 5th, when Japanese burial teams completed their work, they would find around 1,039 bodies that stood atop Manchuria. At 3 a.m. on September the 3rd, Zarubayev reported to Kuropatkin he was running low on ammunition, and he was being slowly beaten back. Then Stackelberg reported this. "I report that my situation is serious, and that, in consequence of the severe losses suffered by my regiment during the last 5 days, I not only cannot without serious reinforcements assume the offensive, but cannot even accept battle. I have therefore resolved to retreat this night at Liaoyang, where I will await fresh orders." After this, Kuropatkin received reports of Orlov's defeat and that Lubavin's cavalry screen was 20 miles away from Mukden. Then Bildering reported that the Russians were forced off Manchuria and that he would most likely have to withdraw and would not be able to continue the offensive actions anymore. At 4 a.m., another message came from Bildering. "Very unfortunate, but since Stackelberg has also retreated, I must decide to retreat to Mukden and beyond. Concentrate there, reorganize and advance." Kuropatkin replied to this, "My communications with Mukden are being threatened by considerable Japanese forces. I am retiring my army to that place, as its first duty is to protect those communications." And thus a 43-mile retreat to Mukden would begin on September the 3rd, and it would end by the 10th. The Japanese had suffered 5,337 deaths and 18,063 wounded. For the Russians, it was 3,611 deaths and 14,301 wounded. It was, in essence, an indecisive battle. An army of 200,000 Russians would slip away to fight another day. The official British history summed up the Battle of Liaoyang as such. "The importance of this battle can hardly be exaggerated. By their victory, the Japanese triumphantly vindicated their strategy and extricated themselves from a position which, at one time, threatened to prove extremely dangerous. Moreover, the knowledge that they emerged victorious from a bitter trial of strength gave them that supreme confidence in their own invincibility, which is the greatest asset of any soldier. Lastly, a reverse following, as it would have upon the failure of the first general assault upon Port Arthur, must have been disastrous for Japan. It is not, therefore, without reason that the 12 days from the 23rd of August to the 3rd of September have been called the most crucial period in the history of the war." Tsar Nicholas II sent Kuropatkin a conciliatory message following the news of the retreat from Liaoyang. From your reports of the fighting at Liaoyang, I appreciate that it was impossible for you to have held that position longer without risk of being completely cut off from your communications. By September the 6th, the Tsar ordered a second Manchurian army to be formed, and both armies would henceforth be led by Alexiev. The Battle of Liaoyang cut off 50,000 Russians at Port Arthur from helping, and nearly 100,000 Japanese likewise. But now the road was wide open for the Japanese to conquer the rest of Manchuria. Hey, I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I am now releasing what was a Patreon exclusive, my 4-part podcast series on Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author of the Final War theory. In many ways, he was a man who caused World War II. And hey, if you like the sounds of that, why don't you check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. Kuropatkin was fed terrible intelligence and believed he was facing a much larger enemy than he actually was. In the end, Kuropatkin fought a valiant battle for Liaoyang and inflicted tremendous casualties upon the Japanese. But Oyama's strategy would win out the day.